aid policies. Now, Asian trap. So let explain it is the very unbalanced kind of allocation of budget. I mean, between the grant versus grant and the loan, and especially Japan is number 1, and South Korea I think number 3, number 4 in terms of the high ratio of the loan. So it is not that the good model. If you talk about the why we have to provide and how we can reform for the South Korean DOD policies in the near future. Okay, how about China? We don't have data yet. But the William and Mary is nearby, to 1 hour distance from here, right? William and Mary has the aid data center, so they collect all the data related to the aid. So they kind of pioneer job, especially collect the Chinese aid. So they use the term ODA-like. We cannot, without the modification, apply the ODA definition to Chinese aid. So you cannot call Chinese ODA. It's not the right term. So Chinese foreign aid or Chinese aid or ODA-like aid. So anyway, if you see here, Chinese government, I think this is 2014, they published the white paper for foreign aid. So according to the white paper, so grants like around 40%, and interest-free loan 8%, and concession loan just like the typical, the concession loan done by the OECD member countries. That is around the 55. So in total, I think the loan ratio, I think 63.8%. It's the highest if you compare to Japan and China. So all 3 major highest loan-based donor countries now located in Asia, East Asia. So such kind of the shame, I mean, from the perspective of international standard. So there are some positive and negative aspects of Chinese aid. There's a lot of debate, and also Suna Chung here, she's the student, and then she's this year, right? This year, admitted by the Georgetown University for the PhD, and then her specialty is Chinese aid. So there are a lot of debate. I mean, Chinese aid quite beneficial or useful for the recipient countries or not. So I just divided 2 different aspects. The first one, positive. Why positive? What is the key characteristic of Chinese aid? First one, no condition. No condition at all. So what kind of condition? What do we mean by conditionality? Just imagine the World Bank and SAP. I mean, structural adjustment program. So the World Bank always attach some the conditionality before they disperse the loan project. So back in 1997 and 1998, Asian crisis, financial crisis, and South Korea they received huge budget support from World Bank and IMF, and we have to, before receiving the money from the World Bank and IMF, we have to restructure all the economic system. So it's very harsh to recipient country if you attach the SAP as conditional. But Chinese aid or the South-South cooperation aid, there's no any severe kind of conditions attached to their own aid. And second, the positive aspect, there's no intervention into domestic politics. I mean, democracy or non-democracy, there's no any importance. I mean, they don't care, right? So they feel like that we have to intervene with a huge budget. They could go. And the third one, infrastructure-based, large-scale project with high speed. So from the perspective of recipient country, I mean the African countries, why not? It's beautiful, right? It's the really great kind of contribution to their own economy. Very fast, and no condition, no intervention, and then infrastructure-based. So constructed like dam, harbor, airport, and hospital is great. But if you look at the other side of the Chinese aid, negative aspect. First one, tied aid. It's almost 100% tied aid. They just use Chinese workers, Chinese money, Chinese company, Chinese materials. They don't use the local, level of some materials and institutional, some benefits or the procedures. And then second one, so some African leaders now criticize Chinese aid. It's kind of new imperialist. aid, and then also the land grabbing. Why? They use the Chinese workers, Chinese company, right, to develop something in, for example, Rwanda. And then after the project is done, they should go back to China, right? But they stay there and make the Chinatown, and then they try to grab land, right? Expand the kind of territory up to mining. So it is quite closely connected to the resource diplomacy. And there are very few remittance from China to Africa. So remittance, still we cannot calculate remittance as one of ODA to the OECD, but remittance is very important. So South Korea is the #1 in East Asian countries in terms of remittance. So Nepali workers in South Korea, they send back their own part of the income to their own hometown. So South Korea, I think, according to the statistical result, is #1. But China is very at the low level. So that's the another negative aspect. I don't know, maybe Chinese government control like the transaction remittance from the Chinese mainland to African countries. I don't know yet, but let me try to figure out. And that's why in a nutshell, some scholars or pundits, they talk about the Chinese aid kind of new imperialist or development partners. Because South-South cooperation, that's nowadays one of the biggest term and then buzzword utilized by the United Nations. Because SDG, Sustainable Development Goals, back in 2015, the UN declared the SDG, that's kind of replacement, the MDG, Millennium Development Goals. So the SDG have how many goals? 17, and then 169 targets, right? So the traditional donor cannot finance all, the 70 different goals and 169 the targets. So they just invite the southern partners, China, India, Brazil, GWIKS. So they just try to fill in the gap, especially in terms of financing. So South-South cooperation or the triangular cooperation, that's kind of new term to support how to achieve the SDGs. So in that sense, China could be identified as development partner for African or other countries in global south. Okay, and competition between China and Japan, especially focusing on the African case. So here, if you look at the China proactive engagement in Africa, why? 2012, FOCAC means Forum on China-Africa Cooperation. So every 3 years, they host the FOCAC for summit to provide something. So back in 2012, the Xi Jinping decided to provide $20 billion for 3 years. And right after that, next year, 2013, this is Japan case, TICAD is the Tokyo International Conference on African Development. So Abe just respond to the Chinese kind of engagement by saying $32 billion for 5 years. And then 2015, Xi Jinping again, pledged to provide $60 billion for 3 years. And then next year, 2016, they got, Abe around the $30 billion for 3 years. So I get back and forth. So every year they just say something new, right? New pledge for the kind of huge budget support. Okay, this is another chart how we can see the competition among 4 countries in Asia to Africa. So this is Japan case. Every 5 years, Japan is the first country to set up kind of the forum between African 50 countries and Japan. So from the 1993 and every 5 years, and then all of a sudden they changed the kind of cycle every 3 years because of China. China they started in 2000, but they just hosted conference every 3 years, so 3-year based. So Japan just tried to follow, right, to contain or compare with China. How about Korea? It's the third, I think they started for the kind of engagement into the Africa since 2006 and up to now. We have 4 different forums, so-called the KF, and in India, there's the last. So 4 major, I think, donors in Asia, they not compare with. how to ensure or to secure some of the resources or the new markets in Africa by using their own the foreign aid. Okay, some framing power of Japan and China, and then I'm going to move to my final comments about why the Nordic model should be adopted for South Korean reformative action. Okay, Japan. As I briefly mentioned, this is the ODA Charter of Japanese government, and one of the sentences to preface, you can recognize here, this relates closely with the assuring Japan's security and prosperity and promoting the welfare of its people. So, even partially, they designed ODA program to support domestic reasons, right? Welfare of people and the security and then some of the national interest. So if you see any ODA charter, British government and USA, I think Canada, only 4 countries of the OECD member countries, they have the ODA charter. South Korea, not yet. And then you can find a single sentence about like that. I mean, how to protect the national interest by using ODA. There's no, only Japanese government is very unique case. And then the loan centers, of course, and the commercialized ODA, and then the concentrating on Southeast Asia and Africa. Why I can dare to say the Japanese pattern of the ODA is commercialized? Because of this. If you see here, almost like $2.6 billion as interest repayment. So this is back in 2016. So Japan actually received more money from developing countries than it gives. If you include interest repayment, but I mean, every country they need to report OECD without interest repayment. Only single original budget, original money they just give. So that money is now returned to the donor country. They report that those exact money without the repayment of the interest. But we have to calculate the interest. Why this is a loan? So 60% of the whole Japanese ODA is now loan-based. And then they started loan project since 1951. Think about it, how many years? More than 50 years, right? So now they receive huge interest repayment from all respective countries. They provide the loans. So this is good model for, I don't know, foreign aid. Why they provide foreign aid? For their own gains, right? So that's why we can say this is kind of, example of commercialized aid. So this is not my story. This is the data from the OECD. Okay, and then of course, some the contention between the China and Japan, and also some containment policy by using ODA, how the can block, the influences of Chinese soft power. So if you see a single map here, this is OBOR, One Belt One Road. So Chinese kind of huge plan from here to the Europe, and then the Abe Shinzo tried to do a kind of plan, containment policy plan, to block like this. That's the first different line, and the second front line in Africa by using ODA. So it's big kind of war, right? Invisible war between the China and Japan. So how South Korea engage this kind of big war by using the ODA? That's kind of big question. And China framing power is huge. Quite huge than the Japanese framing power. So-called the parallel order. So many aspects you can confirm the parallel order between the China and the rest of the world, especially the Western Europe and the USA. So first one, the BRICS-based new development bank and BD at global level. It's kind of parallel organ to World Bank. And then the second is Boao Forum. It's kind of parallel again to the Davos Forum. And then also Silk Road Fund and OBOR. It's kind of huge domestic plan to develop national economy, but it's kind of huge impact on neighboring countries, right? Throughout Central Asia up to, I think, Eastern Europe, even the Western Europe. And then the AIB recently launched, right? The Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank. That's another parallel I think, system to the ADB, Asian Development Bank. ADB is totally controlled by the Japan and USA. Okay, so framing power is quite huge and the grant because maybe it could be new hegemony power or the balance against the U.S. So bipolar system or multipolar system. So all kind of theoretical approach to the current global governance could be you can just brought back when you talk about the U.S. and the China competition by using their subordinate as a superpower. Okay, almost done. Almost done. Last one. Why I'm now talking about the Nordic countries as could be a possible option or best option for South Korea. Some of the very similarities between Nordic countries and South Korea. First one, surrounded by strong powers. We are surrounded by the Japan, China, even US and Russia, right? We are the kind of middle power or small power. So back in I think the interim period between two different wars, a world war, First World War, Second World War, Nordic countries kind of surrounded by superpowers. And for example, even, the Sweden is the exceptional case. Never colonized by any neighboring countries. But Norway occupied by Germany for 5 years. And Denmark also occupied by Germany. And Finland occupied by Russia. So we can see some kind of similarity from how we can respond to the kind of very strong engagement from the neighboring countries by using some kind of not hardcore, the military or economic power, but by using some soft power. And the second point is the relative small scale. So, Nordic country, very famous, they just meeting the international standard. So United Nations always recommend how many percent of ODA should be allocated. That's the 0.7% of GNI should be allocated for ODA. So all OECD member countries, if they allocated budget 0.7% GNI as ODA, poverty will be history. We can make poverty history. That's simply saying Jeffrey Sachs' book, his argument. But only 3 countries, satisfying that kind of criteria. Norway, Britain, sometimes, the Sweden. So, but that's why some of the people think that the Nordic country, the scale of, total scale of ODA is quite large. But if you see the, real scale of the money as ODA, it's quite it's not that big, it's small scale. For example, South Korean ODA scale, size of ODA is larger than Finland. But percentage, if you compare the percentage, it's quite different. South Korea now is 0.14 something, very low. So, by using small scale ODA, how we can maximize our visibility. So if you follow the Japanese way, Chinese way, like a loan-based or Thai data-based, we cannot make some the distinction. Which one is a Korean model? Which one is a Korean the ODA, right? Because the Chinese and the Japanese ODA are larger than South Korea in terms of size. The Chinese case like the 8 times greater, and the Japanese is 5 times greater than South Korean ODA. So we have to keep thinking the strategic kind of management of South Korean ODA. And the third point is sharing colonization occupation. As I said, colonized by the Japan, that's Korean case, quite a long time, but relatively short time they occupied by neighboring countries in the case of Nordic country. But we can share some of the experiences or historical kind of backlash of the colonization. And then humanitarianism is kind of self-identity of Nordic countries. So Nordic country, if you look at the history of Nordic country, I think from the First World War up to now, they keep developing their own self-image to the international public. So the humanitarian assistance, and then the kind of protector for human rights and democracy is kind of the strong, the leader of, strong leader of international norms and rules in terms of the international aid and then some humanitarian activities. So South Korea could be followed that track. Why? We cannot follow Japan or China. I mean, in terms of, I think, the size or scale, as well as the kind of geographical location, because we're surrounded by, as I said, the superpowers. We are not superpower, we are the kind of middle power. So I think humanitarianism could be, I think, very strategic kind of, path for South Korea in order to distinguish our pattern from those two Asian giants, as well as we can just develop our public image to the outward. So we are supportive of human rights and humanitarianism, and then we are quite different from the Chinese and then the Japanese ODA model. That's why you can buy our model, and then we can share some strategic knowledge how to catch up economically, and then we have another kind of strength. That's the democratic kind of legacies. So the candlelight movement, and then the June uprising back in 1987. So we can just recap. Our legacies of the democratization, that history, as one of good kind of package to be exported to the recipient country. So that's a small state identity, and the middle power diplomacy. I think those two different wording could be equivalent to each other. So we can just a little bit modify middle power diplomacy, which could be equivalent to a small state identity of Nordic countries. And finally, soft power. Especially, soft power is kind of long-term perspective, right? How to make our neighbors or the recipient countries as in our friends in the long term. So the humanitarian activities, because going to the African countries, how many donors one single sub-Saharan African country on average, how many donors they can have? 21. 21 different agencies involved in the one single African country. So African country very easily change partners from World Bank to maybe DFID, UK, the agency, maybe JICA. Why? Because conditional. Because engagement into the domestic politics. Because they highly, they criticize the corruption issues in the domestic area. So they always prefer the humanitarianism-based Nordic, ODA, because they talk about Nordic countries talk about very big thing, not detail. The micromanagement. So you just certify some of the key rules of humanitarian assistance to the poverty-stricken persons and people in local area, and no violation of human rights and no violation of democratic principle, and then we can provide. So we can just set up kind of our rule, our principle, according to humanitarian principles, just like what the Nordic country did, and then we can just select the good kind of recipient countries very strategically, and then we can just make our boundary more broader to support our policies. Okay. So some final comments point. Middle power diplomacy, as I already talked about, and then the new government now announced new global South policy because of that problem between China and Korea, and then Chinese government just make some economic retaliation against South Korea. So South Korea now tries to make the new market and new kind of partners rather than China. So now it's just moving down to Southeast Asia, ASEAN, and India and Indonesia. So the thing is how we can just combine ODA policies, embedded in the humanitarianism, and the new global South policy. That's another biggest, task we are now facing. And then I repeatedly, they emphasize we have to minimize conditional loan and maximize grants, and also tied aid and bilateral aid based. So that's why as a final point, I'm not going to say we have to be kind of leading aid giver. We cannot in a short time, but we can just become a known provider. So knowledge sharing. So what is the shortcut for democratization? What is the shortcut for the economic growth? So on the basis of the previous experiences, condensed kind of modality, we can just use, but for the purpose of humanitarians, not economic growth only, or the not, for the purpose of some kind of dictatorship-based country. I mean, we can support the dictatorship-based country because you can just make a shortcut of the economic growth if you take our kind of the recipe. So that is, I think, not the other way. All right, so I think that I'm going to stop here. So all in all, in some, I talk about the briefly Korean history, audit policies, and some current issues and problematic the aspect Korean model, and then move to some Asian track by using the China and Japan cases, and then now just going down to some conclusion. Why not? I mean, we can think of Nordic model as our alternative and a path for the reformative action for the new government. All right, thank you very much.